Good evening. I'm Dr. Sridhar Kalyanasundaram, consultant neonatologist and head of department at Zulika Hospital, Dubai. In this presentation, I'm going to give you an overview on the approach to postnatal management of the newborn. The target audience is going to be general pediatricians who are doing some neonatology, but this will be helpful to anyone who deals with newborns. The objectives are to cover the common postnatal problems we come across, focusing on normal newborn babies. We will discuss in detail about the general assessment of the well neonate and the various aspects of screening in the well neonate, including the newborn blood spot screening, hearing screen, and the critical congenital heart disease screen. We will also discuss the approach to important postnatal problems like hypoglycemia, jaundice, and feeding. When we review the baby for the first time, we have to go through the antenatal period to see if there are any risk factors we have to watch. Obviously, this is not an all-inclusive list, but one of the important things to see is there any risk factor for infection. And the group B streptococcal screening is often done in many hospitals. The mother gets the vaginal sample at 36 weeks as a swab, and the result is usually available at the time of delivery. The obstetrician makes a plan depending on the result. If it is a positive result, mother may receive intrapartum antibiotic prophylaxis. The next part is to see the antenatal maternal screening, and this includes blood tests that we have done to look at risk of hepatitis B, HIV, syphilis, which is a VDRL test, and whether she is immune to rubella. We also see antenatal scan findings. Sometimes you get findings on antenatal scans. Anomaly scans may pick up renal problems. Sometimes they suggest cardiac or gut-related abnormalities and so on. It's also important to see if the mother is diabetic and how the control was, because the diabetic mother, the infant of diabetic mother has risk factors for hypoglycemia, and also if she is a diabetic from early pregnancy, there is risk of malformations. In addition to that, we also look at whether the baby has been growing well in the womb and whether there have been any concerns. We will also see if the baby had delayed cord clamping and delivery. So this is an important topic, and all of us should understand why it is important and how it works. So I'm going to spend a few minutes explaining this to you. Normally, the fetus and the placenta are one continuous circulation. And at any point in time, 20 to 60% of the fetal blood volume is in the placental circulation. So this is actually blood that belongs to the fetus, but due to the intrauterine arrangement, part of it is circulating in the placenta. Delaying the cord clamping for 30 to 180 seconds improves the neonatal blood volume by 40 to 50 ml. And delayed cord clamping is an important recommendation in the new NRP update for resuscitation. This image gives you a picture of what the placenta looks like. And if you see the one on the left-hand side, the umbilical cord is bringing the vessels to the placenta. It gets connected. So the single big vessel is the umbilical vein. And paradoxically, it's the vein that actually brings oxygenated blood to the baby. And the two arteries are shaded blue because the arteries are going to bring back blood from the baby to the placenta. So the placenta does the important job of oxygenating the blood, removing the impurities and the excretory products from the baby, and puts it through to the maternal blood. You can see the subdivisions of the vessels inside the placenta, and the area which is a broad pink area is the maternal part of the placental circulation. So you can see the maternal vessels giving blood to that and draining it out. And this is the area which actually exchanges the material. The exchange material is carried back to the placenta, to the baby. This is the fetal circulation, and the simple point I want to make here is that the lungs, which are the big, all of you can make out which the lungs are obviously. So the lungs do not get much blood flow. They don't breathe. The oxygenation is done by the placenta. So the lung is not really getting as much blood flow. Only 10% of the blood circulation goes through the lungs when the baby is in the womb. After delivery, the pulmonary vessels open up, the lung blood vessels open up, the lung expands, and there is 50% of the circulation going through the lung after delivery, after the first few minutes of life. So when this happens, the blood which is in the placental circulation comes back into the baby, or majority of it comes back. Of course, a small portion stays in the placenta, but a large portion of it, after the lung opens and the circulation enters the lungs, so this blood enters the baby's circulation. If we do early cord clamping before the baby breathes, the portion of the blood in the placenta, which is rightfully the baby's blood, is missed out. And this blood is very rich in not only iron, it's also rich in hematopoietic factors and stem cells, which help the baby in repairing and also has a long-term implication. Studies have clearly shown that in premature babies, delayed cord clamping reduces the risk of intraventricular hemorrhage and the need for transfusions. This is because these babies have a relatively low blood volume, and so even 20% blood volume missing out from the baby circulation can lead to hemodynamic stress. These babies are likely to be sicker, they may have breathing difficulties, they may need ventilatory support. So considering all these factors, the preterm baby has more benefit in terms of reducing major complications like intraventricular hemorrhage. In term babies, even though it's still a significant volume, it doesn't cause as much hemodynamic visibility in the first few days. So we don't see any visible benefit. And the main benefit is in the long term when it improves the iron content. It reduces the risk of iron deficiency till 6 months of age. But as I said, there are many unmeasured benefits like the increased stem cells and the benefit of having a higher hemoglobin in the beginning as well. So there is no risk of polycythemia seen because this blood volume comes with equal amount of plasma as well. So it's not just the cells that are coming in and the viscosity doesn't increase. There is also a slightly increased neonatal jaundice, but it is not very significant when you see the benefits. So the important points to consider in babies needing resuscitation, we have an option to wait till the first breath before clamping. So the benefit is going to be more complete if the baby has taken the first breath, which results in oxygen entering the baby's lungs, the lung blood vessels open, and then the circulation is able to fill into the baby's blood. What do we do in conditions where there is already a high hematocrit, like in polycythemia, growth restricted babies in front of diabetic mothers? There is no clear answer yet, but it is safe to delay clamping at least for a period of time. Stem cell collection is coming up and many parents are having this option being discussed to them during pregnancy. As of now, stem cell storage is specifically approved and indicated only for the parents of the previously affected babies. So if you have a sibling with a treatable condition, you are definitely suggested to collect the stem cells for your subsequent babies. So if you don't have any family history of metabolic problems, collecting stem cells is more like a long-term insurance policy, which we don't know we will ever need. So at the moment, the science is not clear. So you can still try to collect the stem cells. You have the paid banks are probably not the best option. You can donate to the public banks, and obviously delayed clamping should take priority over stem cell collection. You may not get as much blood from the placenta as you would if you clamp early, but you're actually missing out on benefits to the immediate benefits, thinking of a possible long-term benefit which you may not need. Coming on to the topic of postnatal examination. So I'll not be covering the full aspects, but just an overview. The initial assessment after the delivery is done by the nurse, midwife, or doctor attending the delivery. This will depend on the setup where the mother delivers. And there should be at least one full examination by the pediatrician prior to discharging home. So the head-to-toe systemic examination covers the head, face, and mouth. The head, you may have findings which are benign, like a cephalometoma or a caput. Caput is a swelling of the back of the head due to the fluid accumulated around delivery process. Cephalometoma is a small bleed between the skull bone and its covering. It usually resolves on its own, even though the parents may be worried. These two issues do not cause any problems except a slightly increased risk of jaundice. In the face, we are looking at features which suggest an abnormality like dysmorphism. And in the mouth, mainly we are going to look at the gums for tongue tie, as well as any cleft palate if it is there. Palate is the roof of the mouth, and if there is a cleft, you would be seeing it. Examination of the cardiovascular system, this should include feeling the femoral pulses, especially after 24 hours of life. This is to see if there is any evidence of coarctation of aorta, where the femoral pulses will be weak, and as time passes, you may not feel it. In the first 24 hours, it's not very reliable because the patent vectors arteriosus will still be open, and even if there is a block of the aorta coming down, the blood is bypassing that through the PDA. We can listen for a murmur, which may or may not be significant. In the transitional circulation phase, in the first 2 to 3 days, many babies have a faint murmur due to PDA or due to pulmonary flow patterns, and it may resolve with time. Whether we do a scan before discharge or after discharge, depending on your setup. But the heart disease screen is very important in such babies. Respiratory system, obviously you're looking at the breathing pattern, air entry bilaterally, whether there is any concern. The examination of the abdomen is more to make sure the abdomen is not too full or too scaphoid, which may suggest problems as well, and feeling for the organs if they're palpable. Examination of the central nervous system, including the tone and the reflexes, is important. Obviously, questions about how the baby is feeding will guide us on how the baby is overall as well. You should also look at the symmetry of movements, and birth injuries like Erb's palsy or fracture clavicle may be picked up when the movement is not picked up normally. We should look into the eyes for the red reflex. This is very important, and it's an easy assessment once you know how to do it. It's better to do early in the stage when the baby is not crying due to your handling. So start with the red reflex and listening to the heart sounds and listening for the murmur, and then go ahead with the rest of the examination. So the red reflex is quite simple to do. You need an ophthalmoscope, and you set it at the right diopter settings for you. And you have to keep it, hold it close to your eyes, obviously, and then keep it about 30 centimeters from the baby's eyes when the eyes are open. You have to shine light into the pupils, and if you see a red reflex in the background, then it's a positive sign. If you don't see the red reflex, you have to wait patiently. Sometimes when the baby moves, you still see the vessels. A pale fundus may be normal in the dark skin races. A failure of the red reflex will mean that there is a mass inside the eye, or it can be an obscuration like cataract. So it needs further review with ophthalmologist. Examination of the hip is very important to pick up signs of developmental dysplasia of the hip. Even though it's not a common problem, it's very important not to miss it, because over time it may worsen. It's also important to explain to the family that this is a developmental dysplasia, so it progresses with time. You may not be able to pick it at birth, and it may present in the next few months. So one check at birth doesn't rule out, and it needs, if there are any concerns or risk factors, you should continue to monitor the child's hips at follow-up. So we normally refer for hip ultrasound if there is a breech presentation, because the baby is not moving the hip as well in the womb, and there may be space constraint the way the hip is held. So the hip joint, it's a ball and socket type of joint, so the socket doesn't form normally in these situations and may increase the risk of dislocation. If there is a family history where there's a first degree relative with developmental dysplasia of the hip, it puts this baby at risk as well. Female babies are at a higher risk. And if you have abnormal clinical examination, it also puts you at risk, so we have to do the screening. Some countries like Germany do universal hip screening with ultrasound, but it's not cost effective, and in the UK as well as many other countries, it's a screening based on risk factor as I've specified. When we examine the hips, we can keep this short form as a clue that Barlow's dislocates the hip which is in the joint, and Ortolani reduces the dislocated hip. So you can say BDOR to remember. So the Barlow test is basically done with the adduction of the hip and pushing backwards, and Ortolani test is abducting adducted hip and pushing forward the scale trochanter forward. So your hand has to be behind the hip joint, and you'll be pushing forward when a hip which is in joint will come out. So you feel it as a clunk. The hip examination has to be performed last because it's uncomfortable for the baby, and it's also uncomfortable for the parents who are observing it. So you do need a little force when you do the Barlow's test, but don't be too forceful. And repeated testing, even if there is a clunk, is not advised because that can also be not ideal. So we explain to the parents the need for follow-up. The ultrasound is usually done after 3 to 4 weeks of age, because in the first 1 to 2 weeks, the maternal progesterone, which has a relaxing effect on the mother's hips, has a relaxing effect on the baby's hips as well. So we let that effect wear off, and majority of the time the result is normal. Sometimes the shallow joints may need monitoring and orthopedic referral as well. We will review what we mean by the critical congenital heart disease screen. So this is a current topic because it has been introduced in all countries in the past few years. It's taken as a normal mandatory assessment. So this is also called as the oxygen saturation screening. We should perform it close to 24 hours, not too close to delivery if possible. If they are going home early, it's better to do it before 24 hours, at least it is done. And then you may consider repeating it at follow-up if needed. It should be done by measuring the saturation in the right hand, which is the preductal, and either of the foot, which measures the postductal saturation. Baby should be awake, but should not be struggling, and should have regular breathing. We should record this for at least 2 minutes. And the main idea of doing this is to pick up the critical congenital heart disease like the hypoplastic left heart, tricuspid or pulmonary atresia, tetralogy of Fallot, transposition, and TAPVC. The parent should be aware that this doesn't rule out all heart disease. It only rules out the critical heart disease, which causes a mixture of blood or a drop in oxygen in the baby. Incidentally, we may pick up respiratory conditions which are not very apparent. So a baby with a mild aspiration pneumonia or transient tachypnea of newborn may be picked up because you're doing this. Sometimes it may be an early warning sign of a congenital pneumonia developing as well. So this is just the algorithm, how to go about it. The child is in the nursery at more than 24 hours, or if shortly before discharge, if the baby is less than 24 hours of age, and you conduct the screen for 2 minutes or so. The saturation, if it's less than 90% in the right hand or in the foot, then it's a failed test and it's a positive screen. If it is 90 to 95% in the hand or foot, or if there is more than 3% difference, then you repeat the screen in 1 hour, and if the same findings, you can repeat after 1 more hour. If it continues to be abnormal, then it's again taken as a positive screen. If there is more than or equal to 95% in the right hand or foot, and the difference is less than or equal to 3%, then it's a negative screen or a pass test. So to summarize this, so oxygen saturation should normally be more than or equal to 95% at or around 24 hours of age, and it should not be more than 3% pre-postductal difference, that is between the right hand and the left or right foot. The saturation of 90 to 94% should prompt repeat measurement after at least 1 hour. Saturations below 90% should prompt a pediatric assessment and admission and further investigation, including echocardiography. So a senior pediatrician should review the baby and refer to cardiologist if there is a serious concern of a cyanotic heart disease, because the treatment should be immediate in such cases, which may include referral to a higher center. A quick mention of the newborn early warning score. So this is nothing but making people aware of the range of vital signs and to trigger alarm when it goes out of the range for any parameters. So we have these parameters: the temperature, respiratory rate, whether there is grunting, the heart rate, color, which is measured in terms of saturation record, and the neurologic state of the baby. So you have the criteria which fit in the normal range and which fit in the amber range and the red range. So obviously the action would depend on where the baby falls under. So if there is one amber observation, you can contact the junior doctor or the senior midwife in the unit. And if the baby is stable, you make the management plan and review further. Repeat observation should be made in 30 minutes. In normal units, observations are made every 4 hours and plotted on that neonatal early warning scores sheet. If 2 amber or 1 red observation, the pediatrician should immediately review, and further action will be decided based on what findings are there. The next screening that we will discuss is a newborn hearing screen. It's important to remember that hearing screen became universal in many countries in the past 10 to 12 years. And it's very important because deafness which is picked up within the first 3 months of age has better outcome in terms of early intervention and support to the family as well. So not all deafness is picked up because some deafness may develop over time. But if there is a family history of deafness, if the child has received gentamicin or similar antibiotics, if there is a risk of infection in the baby at birth, if there was a high level of jaundice, these babies should definitely get the hearing screen. But ideally, all babies should get the hearing screen. We have 2 tests which can be done, the otoacoustic emission or the auditory brainstem evoked response. Most of the units use otoacoustic emission, but if otoacoustic emission is failed initially, you can do an ABR, or you can repeat the otoacoustic emission and go for the ABR after some time. The otoacoustic emission is a quicker test and the baby doesn't need to be sleeping. The disadvantage is that if the fluid in the inner ear, middle ear is there, it can falsely cause a negative result. So it works by sound stimulating the cochlea, which results in the outer hair cells vibrating. This vibration produces a nearly inaudible sound that echoes back into the middle ear. The sound can be measured with a small probe inserted into the ear canal. Hearing loss greater than 25 to 30 decibels will result in no otoacoustic emission being detected, so this will mean the baby failed the test on that side. You can also get a negative result if there is blockage of the outer ear canal due to flakes or the vernix obstructing it, or the presence of middle ear fluid. Damage to the outer hair cells of the cochlea can also produce a failed test. So it's important to reassure the parents of any baby with a failed test in the beginning, and we can repeat the test after 2 weeks or so, or do an ABR. Majority of the situations, 90% of the failures in the beginning are false failures, so they pass the test, but it's important to repeat it to make sure we pick it up. One important point to remember is that if we just go clinically, we may miss unilateral deafness or a lower level of deafness. So parents may say my baby is responding to sound or winks when the door closes, or we speak to the baby and so on. But a single ear hearing will result in the same response. So unilateral deafness will not be picked up unless you do the hearing screen. So this is an image showing the otoacoustic emission being performed on a quite a happy baby. The newborn screening is a very important test. This is the blood test or the blood spot test or the heel prick test. In UK, we call it the Guthrie test. So different names for the same thing. This is the process where we test the newborn babies for treatable genetic, endocrinologic, metabolic, or hematologic diseases. So the key point here is the conditions are treatable, and usually picking it up early results in a better outcome. So the most important example is hypothyroidism, where if you don't do the newborn screening, as in the unfortunate days when we were training, say 20-25 years ago, we had babies with congenital hypothyroidism coming with permanent brain injury. So that is not acceptable anymore, and that is the reason we advocate the newborn screening to be done for all babies. So it's a battery of tests. It's based on filter paper tests. The test is relatively cheaper than doing all these 40-odd tests separately. It's much cheaper because it's run in groups. So the screening is done in groups, and if any group fails the test, they go through individual samples and repeat it. So that's why they do it on filter paper spots. Some of the spots are saved for future use as well. And the test is typically performed between 3 to 5 days in most units. In units which discharge early, 36 hours is the earliest you can do the test. If you do it before 36 hours, you may have false positives for hypothyroidism because of the TSH surge which happens in the babies. We may need repeating the test in the premature babies and on babies not on feeds. We should remember to take the sample prior to any blood transfusion if the baby requires one. If the baby is not fully fed by that stage, we may need to repeat it at least 2 weeks after the transfusion. And most of the units who look after extreme preterm babies repeat the sample once or twice before they go home. So the most important tests, usually the thyroid stimulating hormone for congenital hypothyroidism. Phenylketonuria is tested for galactosemia, cystic fibrosis, G6PD deficiency. 17-hydroxyprogesterone for adrenal problems. Hemoglobinopathies, sickle cell, alpha thalassemia are tested. Beta thalassemia is not tested usually in the newborn screen. biotinidase deficiency, medium chain acyl CoA dehydrogenase, and organic acidemia or amino acid disorders. So this leads to a total of 35 to 40 conditions being tested. Any unit that does the newborn screen should have a system to take the sample and send it in a safe way to the lab, which usually does it. The results should be reported in a timely fashion, and there should be a critical reporting system, especially for results like hypothyroidism, 17-hydroxyprogesterone, or galactosemia being abnormal. So there should be a way to inform the parents immediately. The parent should be aware of when to contact the hospital for the result, and prompt action should be taken if any abnormal result is there. So the thyroid abnormality should require urgent action to confirm the diagnosis and treat early. Usually a TSH cutoff of more than 10 triggers this, and then we have to investigate and review the need for treatment. 17-hydroxyprogesterone levels are usually higher in the preterm babies, and so a repeat sample may show a normal result. The immune reactive trypsinogen, which is done for cystic fibrosis, often gives a false positive result in the beginning, and then the repeat tends to be normal. However, if persistently high, we have to do the sweat chloride or genetic testing. In terms of galactosemia testing, it depends on whether you are measuring the galactose level or you are measuring the enzyme level. Measuring the galactose level may miss some changes, but if you are measuring the enzyme, you may pick up variants like the Duart variant. The enzyme level is in the 10 to 25% of normal range, and obviously if the repeat level and the galactose level are better, you can breastfeed these babies. Galactosemia result abnormality may mean that your baby needs to avoid lactose in the diet. Cord care. So it's important to know that the umbilical cord should be looked after properly. There is no need to routinely use alcohol wipes, antibiotic powders, or creams, and if you use any of these, it may actually delay the separation of the cord. You should avoid covering the cord with a nappy, so the nappy should be folded below. This means it doesn't accrue moisture, because if you are closing it, it becomes anaerobic. Anaerobes multiply and it may be smelly. It becomes soggy and it breaks off unevenly. So it's important to leave it to dry. The colonization with the aerobes is important, and it causes the separation at the base. So keeping it dry is important. If the cord is starting to separate at the base, it will be a bit sticky around the edges. So cleaning those sticky areas with wet cotton or alcohol swab at that stage when it is separating is fine. The advice for cord care can be different in developing countries, especially in rural areas where hygiene may be an issue. But in developed countries where infection is not a big concern, it's important to follow the advice as above. Some studies in developing countries support the use of antibiotic application, but in the past 8 years in UAE, I have not seen a single significant umbilical sepsis. Possibly one baby where it wasn't clear why the infection happened. Redness around the cord site or purulent discharge, we should consider umbilical sepsis. This is potentially serious because the umbilical cord, the umbilical vein runs through the liver, and if the infection in the umbilicus reaches the liver, it can be dangerous. And there is a condition called portal hypertension which can present later. That's also important. So this is a typically infected umbilicus. You have significant redness all around, and sometimes pus discharge comes from here. That is an indication for IV antibiotic treatment, intravenous antibiotics. Umbilical granuloma is a far commoner problem where you get a little bit of the granulation tissue remaining at the base. Majority of the time, if you keep it clean and dry, it shrinks with time. So normally, if it is not oozing, we don't need to do anything. If there is a definite ooze, we can apply some fusidin or antibiotic creams. And if it persists even after 2-3 weeks of age, we can consider treatment. One of the traditional ways of treating it is applying a little bit of salt, but remember that salt is granular and crystalline. It can abrade if you rub. So if you are applying salt, leave it for a few minutes, 2 to 3 hours, and then you have to wash it off. You can apply it 2-3 times a day and review after a few days. If it persists, you may need silver nitrate cauterization if it is significant sized. If it is small, you can just observe it. So you should also differentiate it from umbilical polyp and persistent vitellointestinal duct. So if it is looking red and bulging, we may need to refer to the surgeon to think of a polyp or an adenoma in the umbilicus. This will need resection. So in terms of eye care, we should remember that a mild sticky eye and some watering is common in the first 2 to 3 days. So this is related to the congestion where the head is in a descendant depending position, and the labor process where the squeezing effect happens also leads to congestion. So if there is a cord around the neck or some pressure, it can lead to more congestion. So this is the same reason why a subconjunctival hemorrhage may happen in the white part of the eye, small blood spots, and they tend to be absorbed over time. Some countries use erythromycin eye ointment as prophylaxis. Erythromycin is not routinely available, it's relatively expensive. Ophthalmia neonatorum in our clinical use is not very common. So a close watch and early diagnosis and treatment is essential. So if you see significant pus crusting and so on in the initial few days, it's very important. Chlamydial discharge usually happens a little later. So you have to remember both these conditions. So another problem we often see is watering which persists after the tears are produced by the time the baby is 2 to 3 weeks of age. Newborn babies do not produce tears, and after 2 to 3 weeks, a tear starts producing, and then there is stickiness noted in the eye and watering. Usually, it's a mild stickiness soon after waking up from sleep due to the mucus crusting. So you can see the lacrimal gland is a tear-producing gland. The tear comes into the eye, and then it drains into the nose through the lacrimal punctum. The nasolacrimal duct drains into the nose. So the lacrimal sac is at the inner margin. So we are actually massaging between the eyes and the nose in an upward and downward fashion. Little pressure is needed. You should use clean hands. And if there is a tear duct block, the massage and cleaning is the most important part. Usually you don't need antibiotic treatment. Of course, many babies with this condition may persist to have this block for a few months. The ophthalmologists usually do not treat this condition till a year or so. So if the child is doing well, this reassurance and continuing to massage should be adequate. Vitamin K prophylaxis, it's important to have knowledge of why we give and what to do if the parents do not want the injection. So it's aimed at preventing early and late onset hemorrhagic disease of the newborn. So there is poor placental transfer of the vitamin K, and breast milk is low in vitamin K as well. The function of the vitamin is to gamma carboxylate the glutamate residues in factors 2, 7, 9, and 10. These are important clotting factors, and protein C and S, which help with clotting as well. So these factors are inactive without the above change. So if vitamin K is low, you have an increased risk of bleeding. The incidence is variable. The early onset bleed, which usually happens within the first 3 to 5 days, has an incidence which is higher at 0.1 to 0.5%. Late onset is not common. It's 1 in 15,000, but it's a more serious condition because it can present with intracerebral bleed, which unfortunately can have long-term problems. If the mother is on medications like anticonvulsants or warfarin, there can be an accelerated form of the early hemorrhagic disease, which can be serious. So vitamin K should be given very early in these cases. The intramuscular route is a preferred route, just 1 milligram intramuscular in term babies and 0.4 milligram per kilogram in preterm babies is given. It's important to give the intramuscular dose even in the preterm babies because of the depot effect. Because of the depot effect in the muscle, because it's a fat soluble vitamin, it continues to release over time, and that's why one injection is enough for both early and late onset disease. If we are using the oral route due to parental choice, repeated dosing will be needed because it's not having this depot effect. A 2 milligram per dose can be used on days 0, 7, and 28 as a minimum, but you can use it more frequently as well. The same intramuscular preparation is used for oral use as well. In terms of G6PD deficiency, there is a possible risk because gonocchion is listed in the risk medicines, but we don't usually see any effects. And because this condition is not known in most of the babies at birth, it only comes through the newborn screening. It's important to give the vitamin K as well, except if there is a family history of G6PD deficiency where a previous baby had hemolysis with vitamin K. There are theoretical concerns from past reports which were not substantiated of cancer-like reactions, sarcoma and so on, but they are not at all concerns, and bigger studies have been done which proved them beyond doubt. Hypoglycemia risk is an important point to be aware of in the newborn period. So we follow risk factor-based screening. If the baby is symptomatic for any reason, obviously we have to think of low sugars. In an asymptomatic baby, large for gestational age or small for gestational age babies are taken as a risk because of hyperinsulinism like presentation, as well as low stores in the small for gestational age babies. Infant of diabetic mother, if the mother is on beta blockers like labetalol for hypertension. In premature babies, because their metabolic rate is more, they have poor stores and the liver is not fully mature, so they don't produce as much sugar from the liver. Symptomatic babies, as we discussed, can be poor feeding, lethargy, excessive tremulousness, respiratory distress, seizures. We should think of hypoglycemia. So the most important point is there is no routine blood glucose check for well babies with no risk factors. This is because all babies go through a physiologic phase of hypoglycemia when there is an adder of the blood sugar around 1 to 6 hours of age, and then it starts picking up on its own. It's also important to remember that if you test well babies, the mothers may be discouraged and breastfeeding may be difficult as well. In babies with risk factors, the reason we test is because we know they are at higher risk of brain injury if the sugar does drop and they can't use the alternative fuels efficiently or they don't have enough fuel. That's why we are testing them. Ensure early breastfeeds and skin-to-skin care, which will also stimulate the breastfeeding. We perform the blood glucose 1 hour after the first feed in stable babies. Please discuss with the parents before giving formula milk if it is indicated. Some units may need informed consent if you are in the baby-friendly hospital initiative. Babies who are symptomatic or have persistently low readings are likely to need NICU admission and IV fluids. In terms of neonatal jaundice, it's a very common problem. It's an important factor in determining the timing of discharge as well as the timing of the first follow-up and further follow-up. Early discharge has been shown to increase the risk of kernicterus, and in the early 2000s in US, when the insurance mandates caused early discharges without a proper follow-up plan, an increase in brain damage due to the jaundice happened. So subsequently, the American Academy produced guidelines, and all over the world we are following similar guidelines. So each unit should have clear-cut guidelines and plan to ensure the best practice. Obviously, we are testing more babies, we may be treating more babies, but the most important motto here is to prevent brain injury, which is preventable, because in the current age, we cannot accept any brain injury. We should identify if the baby has risk factors for jaundice, which may mean Rh negative mother or mother is O positive with AB or AB baby. This is called the ABO setting. Not all babies with the ABO setting have a risk of jaundice. If you have previous pregnancy where similar blood group setting was there and the baby didn't get jaundice, it's more reassuring because it's related to the mother's secretor status. And the positive direct antibody test, if one of these two conditions are there, it could be positive, but it could also be positive because the mother received anti-D during pregnancy. That will be weakly positive in this situation. This is not a risk factor for jaundice. If it is due to rare blood group incompatibilities, it is a risk factor and we have to take it seriously. Bruising or cephalometoma, where there is a blood collection on the scalp, increase the risk of jaundice. The babies who are born less than 39 weeks, even though they are term above 37 weeks, they have a higher risk of jaundice because the liver is not fully mature. And premature babies, of course, are at higher risk. And if the baby has risk factors for early onset sepsis, there may be a risk of jaundice increasing. Some race factors also are there. Chinese babies may be having a higher risk of jaundice. Primigravida mothers, due to the risk of feeding difficulties, may have more jaundice. If you are formula feeding the baby, there is a lower risk, but that is absolutely not a reason to give formula feeding. Breastfeeding is the best in all situations. So if the jaundice does come into the treatment zone, you will decide that based on phototherapy charts, and age-appropriate plotting of the jaundice levels is important. Usually we don't treat based on the skin test, and if the jaundice comes in the higher range in the treatment zone, we recommend close monitoring and a blood test for the jaundice to confirm. So the American Academy charts I mentioned, we also have the Butani and Measles curves to guide the risk assessment and discharge planning. There is a Billy tool, which is an online tool where you can plot the bilirubin, which helps you discuss the same aspects. The NICE guidelines give you gestation-specific charts for preterm babies from 23 weeks onwards. It's important to remember that different hospitals may use different units. So micromole, 17.1 micromoles per liter equals 1 milligram percent. So roughly 100 micromoles is around 5.8 milligram percent. So it's important to monitor the bilirubin, have a guideline in your unit as to when the test is done. It may depend on the risk factors, and all babies should have at least 1 or 2 bilirubin readings recorded before discharge, depending on whether it's a vaginal delivery or a cesarean delivery. The high-risk babies need closer monitoring. Encourage exclusive breastfeeding, but you may take measures to improve milk output and keep parents informed. If the baby is being discharged with jaundice, follow-up timing should be based on the bilirubin level. A baby of lower gestational age, early discharge, a baby on exclusive breastfeeding, especially if the mother is primigravida, the first baby. Excessive weight loss, these babies need earlier review. You also ensure that the mother had feeding support with a lactation consultant and knows how to express and top up express milk, and also how to recognize if the baby has any signs of poor feeding. So early review is indicated. We should balance the risk of jaundice with the local follow-up policies. In UK, for example, the health visitors go home by day 3, day 5 to check the bilirubin at home. In UAE, the parents have to come to the hospital with a definite follow-up within 2 to 3 days of discharge. Transcutaneous bilirubinometer is a very helpful tool to assess the risk of jaundice. It's not a definitive reading, but it gives you a guide as to whether to do the blood test. And if the transcutaneous bilirubin is not too high, you can decide the timing of the next review depending on how close to the treatment level it is. So when the transcutaneous bilirubin or a Billy check value is more than 13 milligram percent, when the baby comes for the follow-up, we should request a serum bilirubin to be on the safer side. While under phototherapy, transcutaneous bilirubin check is not reliable, it's going to read lower, even if you use a patch on the skin. So if the baby was having a significant level of jaundice prior to starting, it's important to repeat the serum bilirubin. If it was a borderline result and clinically baby is improving, you may not need to repeat, but a close follow-up after discharge is important. In terms of feeding, it's important to encourage breastfeeds, and hospitals should follow the baby-friendly practices. Tongue tie might have an impact on breastfeeding. You may need to evaluate to that with a lactation consultant, and some babies with tongue tie will need treatment if it interferes with latching. We should explain to all mothers about the physiology and natural time course of breast milk output, because the mothers are very anxious when they feel the baby is crying all the time. So they should be reassured that all mothers take 2 to 3 days to produce milk, and regular feeding is the best way to stimulate. She should be relaxed. We should support her so the latch is good, and we should point out to signs of baby getting milk, like the baby's satiety, improving urine output, and improving weight. The weight loss also should be explained to her. The reason we are monitoring is to be safe, but a degree of weight loss is normal. If it exceeds 10% or so, then it's more serious. We should avoid the bottle if the baby needs brief supplements due to hypoglycemia or other factors. We should use cup or syringe feeds in this situation to encourage breastfeeding. Infantile colic, parents may be briefed when they come for the follow-up that it is a normal problem. Giving medications may not be necessary. Proper feeding techniques and appropriate support to the family is what is needed in majority. Even if you use a medicine like dexamethasone, it may reduce the crying briefly, but it is not going to change the course. So patience, reassurance, and just watching the baby for a period of time should be adequate. Vitamin supplements are important. In term babies, we give vitamin D supplements for the first 4 to 6 months on its own. After 4 to 6 months, you may start iron supplements in breastfeeding babies, as well as consider a multivitamin supplement. Even if the baby is on formula feeds, it's better to continue vitamin D supplements. Formula milk is already supplemented with iron and other multivitamins, so the need for those supplements become less. However, as the baby starts weaning foods and the milk volume is reducing, these babies may need additional supplements. It's very important to emphasize when we review the patients in the clinic on holistic care. So review the growth, development, aspects like dental hygiene, which some parents may not be aware of, advice on nutrition, how to start weaning, when to start, what to give, immunization review, discuss both mandatory and optional vaccines, and explain the importance of each. When the child starts getting older, importance of minimizing screen time, proper communication in the family, encouraged language development. Screen time is a very important problem because of the culture and the world we live in. So parents should stop exposing the babies or not start at all. And especially in the first 4 months to 18 months of age, this is the age when language and behavioral development is gaining ground. There should be also some introduction to the concept of discipline right from the babies reaching a 7 to 8 month stage, because that's when they start knowing tantrums and they start insisting on things. Home safety is an important aspect, accident prevention. So it's important to mention that the babies, as they start moving as early as 4 months, we shouldn't leave them alone at a height. Better to sleep in a bed with elevated sides, and do not leave them alone on a sofa bed or anything like that, even for a brief time. You cannot predict when accidents will happen, and they happen within a few seconds before you can act. It's also important to protect furniture. The edges may need rubber coating. You may have to protect electric points. If you have a staircase, you will need a stair gate. And it's also important to have toys of older siblings which may have smaller parts away from these babies' reach. Hot objects or liquid should never be near the babies, because we often see burns from coffee or tea spilling on the baby's chest. We often see babies reaching out to the hot iron from the clothes ironing, and accidents prevention can never be emphasized enough. So a few congenital anomalies may come up either at the initial assessment or from the antenatal reports. A single umbilical artery, it's something where if the antenatal screening reports are normal, the renal scan, everything is normal, we don't usually do anything more. Congenital cataract, if you pick up on the abnormal red reflex, you have to refer to the ophthalmologist. You may need additional tests if you consider any syndromes or viral infections. The preauricular tag, again, if your antenatal scans were normal, you don't need any further assessment. Cosmetic wise, if the baby is older, they can go to a plastic surgeon. Supernumerary digits, similar thing, no specific test needed. Again, treatment will be cosmetic based. Dysmorphism has to be assessed by a senior before any comments can be made. You should review the pregnancy double marker testing or triple marker testing or nuchal cord thickening. Sometimes they may have had amniocentesis already in pregnancy, so if you review those results before you comment. Undescended testis is not uncommon, especially if the baby is preterm or borderline term. If it is unilateral and you can feel the testis in the inguinal canal, it's likely to come down with time. If you can't feel the testis on both sides, it needs careful evaluation. Ultrasound may be indicated in some of these cases, and pediatric surgery review should be considered. Cleft lip and palate, they need appropriate support. Cleft palate team. If there are major anomalies, the management is obviously dictated by what anomaly you find. And if there is antenatal renal pelvic dilatation, again, you have to follow the algorithm for the same according to the level of dilatation, whether it is unilateral or bilateral. So bilateral renal pelvic dilatation in the male baby, you have to watch carefully for posterior urethral valve, which in some cases may be a severe presentation. The last part is about sudden infant death syndrome preventive measures. So not everyone is aware of this condition. So unfortunately, in the normal population, a certain proportion of babies, not a big number. It used to be a high number previously, but nowadays it's reducing. So it's not a common condition, but still about 1 in 400 to 1 in 1,000 babies may have sudden infant death. And certain measures definitely reduce the risk to well below these numbers I mentioned. So we should place healthy infants on their backs to sleep and place the baby on a firm mattress to sleep, and they should never be on a soft surface. In case they roll, their face may get into the soft area and they may not be able to breathe. To prevent rebreathing, do not put blankets, comforters, stuffed toys, or pillows. Any wrap used for the baby should be compact. It shouldn't have a big loose end which can obstruct the face of the baby. A big adult kind of blanket should never be used for babies. Cotton wraps which can be easily wrapped and tucked should be used. Do not use bumper pads in cribs. There is a potential risk of suffocation or strangulation. Make sure your baby receives all the recommended vaccines, as the immunization reduces sudden infant death by 50%. Make sure the baby does not get too warm while sleeping. So in the newborn period, a room temperature of 23 to 25 degrees as suits the parents is appropriate. If the room is too warm, then the baby may go into deeper sleep and making it more difficult to arouse if there is a problem like choking during feeds. This may lead to sudden death. Do not smoke, drink, or use drugs while pregnant, and do not expose the baby to second-hand smoke. This increases the risk of SIDS as well. Receive early and regular prenatal care. Make sure the baby has regular well baby checkups. Breastfeeding reduces the incidence of SIDS, and if you have reflux, gastroesophageal reflux disease, be sure to follow the doctor's guidelines on feeding and sleep positions. Appropriate management is important, as the reflux may cause choking episodes, and that's important to consider. Use of pacifiers has been linked to a lower risk of SIDS, possibly because of better self-regulation. You have to balance this with breastfeeding. I don't avoid the use of pacifiers if the baby has persisting crying issues in the first 1 month to 3 months of age. Try not to use it beyond 3 months. Don't use it in the first 2 weeks of age when the baby is learning to latch. If the parents are strongly against use of pacifier, there is no need to force them because of this benefit. While infants can be brought into a parent's bed for nursing or comforting, the parent should return them to their cribs or bassinets when they're ready to sleep. It's better to keep the cribs and bassinets in the room where the parents sleep. So the babies and the parents sleep in the same room, but not in the same bed. So I have given you a few important points about the normal newborn care to stimulate your interest into wider reading. So thank you for your attention.